Okay, so thank you for joining us. Good evening to all. We're going to be learning a little bit of Torah here tonight. So I'm going to start off by thanking our sponsors. So first of all, thank you to Karen and Dan Volter, who are sponsoring to commemorate the yahrzeit of Karen's father, Zisha Ben Zev. So the neshama should have an aliyah. Naso Mazel Tov to the Volters for a new granddaughter. Also,
Thank you.
that's good. Nor Nachas. Also, this shir is also being sponsored, and our gathering and our learning here tonight is sponsored by Annie Foreman, and it's to commemorate the yahrzeit of her mother, Chaya Gittel Bas Yehuda Aryeh. And we don't forget Mrs. Fasten. So may our words of Torah here that we're going to be studying here tonight be a schus for the very special neshama of Zisha Ben Zev and Chai Gittel Bas Yudaria, and they do thank you. So what we want to achieve over the next 45 minutes is really a brief review of the significance of the 15th of Av. This Shabbos, if you look at your calendar, it's going to be day 15 of the month. And it's considered a very significant day in our tradition. Now, when it comes to that day, there are two things to study. Number one, activities that were done on that day. In other words, we have many significant days on the calendar. Some days we are required to do specific acts like light candles. Other days we're supposed to eat specific foods like cheesecake and latkes on different holidays. So when it comes to the 15th of the month of Av, the Mishnah describes activities that were done on that day. And then the Talmud provides for us a list of historical events that occurred on that day, which indicate that the day has significance. Now, as we're going to study the Talmudic authorities sharing with us these events, you will sense that all of them have one thing in common, and that is Jewish unity. And what we're going to do, study a Mishnah that tells about the activities of the day, and then look at the sources as to how that day became significant. So what we're going to do is we're going to share the screen here, and we're going to study inside a section of the Mishnah. So you see it here. It starts off with the words Amar Rab Shimon ben Gamliel. So I'm quoting to you from a Mishnah in Tractate Ta'anit, towards the end of that tractate. And the authority we're going to be quoting is Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. And he tells us that you should know, Lo hayu yamim tovim leIsrael. There were no better days for the people of Israel, like the 15th of Av and Yom HaKippurim, two happy days. Now, when you think about Yom Kippur, you most probably think about the fact that, wait a second, I'm not getting my coffee on Yom Kippur. Why is that identified as a Yom Tov? So obviously there are some challenges as physical beings that we have to recognize regarding Yom Kippur, but we have the ability to see the big picture. And the big picture is that our identity is more than just the body. There is a soul. And the soul carries a burden that is completely released when you arrive on Yom Kippur. So Yom Kippur, I think we know very well, is a very happy day. But what we are focusing now is on the fact that Chamisha Asar Be'av is identified as a very happy day. And do you know what happens on the 15th of Av? So I'm going to move on to the English translation, because the daughters of Jerusalem would go out in white clothes and dance in the vineyards. And then they would interact with young men, and it was a day of shidduchim, of matchmaking. That is what the 15th of Av was about. Now, we don't want to turn it into some kind of Valentine's Day, right? Obviously, it must be more to it. But what we do see, it was designated as a day that you bring people together. There are different ways of bringing people together. They're all important. Some of them perhaps has to do with the fact that if, let's say, you had an issue with someone else, well, the 15th of Av is a day that you could unite. Sometimes perhaps you could look at a group of people within the Jewish nation, and you look at their activities, and they seem problematic to you. But perhaps, as we'll see, the 15th of Av gives you the ability to reassess things. And you will reassess it with the perspective that, you know what, we're all one nation. Practically speaking, it was utilized for the most important unification, for the most important union that we are familiar with as humans and as Jews. And that was obviously the path to marriage. And therefore, it turned into a day of shidduchim. It's important to note that we find specifically Bnot Yerushalayim, the daughters of Jerusalem, would utilize this day. And perhaps a way of understanding it is as follows. This shidduchim system, where you dance in a vineyard and they go ahead and they turn to a young man and they say, lift up your eyes and see what you choose for yourself, doesn't sound so traditional, right? I cannot imagine in a community where the young man is wearing a black hat that this would actually work. Well, what the Mishnah is telling us is the following. You know, as good Torah Jews, there are two very important things that we have to keep in mind. One, yira, the concept of fear, healthy fear. In other words, due to the fact that as we live, we do very significant things, and we have to realize that there's an impact, that there are things that come about due to our actions. So therefore, we fear the idea that there's a higher authority and there's significance in what we do. Yirat shamayim, fear of heaven. It is a concept that exists in our tradition. But there's also a concept called shlemut, shalom, unity. And at times, these two concepts come into conflict. If, let's say, I'm interacting with a group of Jews and they want to pray by the Western Wall, and their style of prayer is such that it's not halachic. So now you have a very significant challenge here. Because on the one hand, when it comes to the fear of heaven, and the fear of heaven, the way we achieve it is by following the halachic system, we have to reject such practices. On the other hand, there's a concept called shalom. There's something called peace, that sometimes you have to turn a blind eye and you have to allow things for the sake of peace. There has to be somewhere that could perhaps give us some guidance. There has to be a location where we could get guidance, or perhaps even some kind of spiritual energy to deal with this challenge appropriately. What city has the perfect balance where it provides the Jew also the fear, the yira, and also the shlemut, the idea that, you know what, don't forget about unity. Welcome to Yerushalayim. So therefore, it was the daughters of Jerusalem that could utilize this system of creating shidduchim, because it was a place that carried the yira. The young men, right, meeting the young woman, if you have the Yerushalayim element, it's not going to go in the wrong direction. On the other hand, if you use this system throughout the Jewish world, and suddenly in Lakewood, instead of the traditional matchmaker, you're going to have dances, there might be a little bit of issue because you might not have the perfect balance of yira and shlemut. So what we studied so far is a Mishnah, but our main focus is going to be in analyzing several Talmudic statements that share with us the significance or the roots of that day. The day of the 15th of Av has roots, and there are events that occur. And it seems to be that on that day, these events indicate that the day itself has significance. Now, we're studying it now because this Shabbat, in about 24 hours from now, we are entering into the 15th of Av. And for the educated Jew, it should be a very important and happy moment because we view it as the day where we achieve complete recovery from the Tisha B'Av mode. In other words, you know that we have this concern that during the month of Av, our mazel is no good. And people do take that into consideration with practical decisions, who they're going to interact with, right? Are they going to go ahead and challenge an authority or go ahead and deal with an issue with the government official? In the month of Av, there's this concern about our mazel. But the mazel turns good by the 15th of Av. Things are fixed. Things are fixed. So we have to hold on for another 24 hours and then we fix it. And what we're going to see is that events that historically occurred indicate that it is a day where we fix Tisha B'Av and we achieve shlemut, Jewish unity. We're going to address that very soon. But I'm going to start off by reading a statement in the Talmud, where the Talmud tells us in the name of Rav Yehuda, in the name of Shmuel, where he's trying to understand what historically occurred on the 15th of Av that gives the day significance. And he tells us that it is the Yom, the day, Shehutru Shvatim, where the tribes were allowed lavo ze bazeh, to connect, to marry into one another. The tribes of Israel were suddenly allowed to marry into one another. What is Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel referring to? So we all know the story of the daughters of Tzlafchad, very inspiring women who, after making a claim, actually inherit land in Eretz Israel. But that created a challenge, and it was addressed by the members of their tribe. Their challenge was, if these women actually inherit land, and then they get married as they did, and if by any chance the men they married are from a different tribe, so the result is that their children are from a different tribe. So within a generation or two or three, areas that were really designated for the tribe of Menashe will be transferred to the sons, perhaps, of the daughters of Tzlafchad, who might be from a different tribe. And the result is going to be that one of the tribes is going to be losing an area within its ancestral land. They were extremely uncomfortable with it. So therefore, at the end of the book of Bamidbar, Moshe Rabbeinu tells the daughters of Tzlafchad, you must marry within your tribe. Some commentators said it was a recommendation. Others understand it to be an obligation. But whatever it is, it appears that for the generation that entered into the land of Israel, women who inherited land were not to marry the one they fell in love with, but rather it had to be, they were limited, and they were told that you must marry within your tribe. Not ideal, not ideal. And perhaps it prevented some unions that could have been quite magnificent. And more than that, We're supposed to view ourselves as one nation. Imagine telling a young lady that you can't marry anyone but within your tribe. Are we really one nation if she cannot go beyond those who are basically relatives? So one day, it appears, the scholars reanalyzed the situation and they determined that this limitation was only applicable to the generation of entry. From now on, they declared at a specific day, from now on, women, even if they inherited land, could marry whoever they want. It was the 15th of Av when they were inspired to look at it differently. So it was a Yom, a day, Shehutru, where they granted permission for the tribes of Israel, for the women, Lavo Zeh B'Zeh. A very happy day that symbolizes Jewish unity. We're one. It's not my tribe and your tribe. Today, my tribe and your tribe might be Ashkenazi, Sephardi, might be Polish and Hungarian, to speak in Toronto language, right? But rather an understanding we're all from one nation. Marry the one that you desire. Now, briefly, there's a fascinating Tosafot. So I'm quoting something now from the French school of rabbis. And they write something which for the past 700 years, authorities have been struggling to try to understand what on earth is the Tosfot telling us. So briefly, the way the Tosfot works is that he quotes from the Talmud, Yom Shehutrush Hashvatim Lavo Zeh B'Zeh. He quotes from the Talmud. And then he adds, Perush, do you know what it means? Dehainu Yom Tov. It is a Yom Tov. Now, Tosfot is basically explaining to us that due to the fact that the tribes can marry one another, we no longer limit the women from marrying men from other tribes, it's a Yom Tov. Now, Tosfot is adding absolutely nothing. The Mishnah says, Yamim Tovim, we don't need the Tosfot to share with us this information. And it's been a major struggle. And I would like briefly to share with you an insight from a rabbi. His name was Rabbi Shlomo Gansfried from Ungvar. And anyone who ever studied from the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch is familiar with this man. He was a tremendous Torah scholar and a good writer. And I grew up with studying from Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, and I'm sure many did. Many people still have it on their shelves. Rabbi Gansfried had descendants who landed up in the United States. They're Talmidei Chachamim. I knew there was a Dr. Irwin Fried in Buffalo who was a great-great-grandson of Rabbi Shlomo Gansfried, and he looked exactly like his grandfather. The only thing that Dr. Fried was missing was the beard and payas. But that's how he looked, and I was always amazed. His children are Baruch Hashem Talmidei Chachamim. So he provides for us an insight to appreciate what the Tosfot is telling us, Perush Dehainu Yom Tov. And he says the following. So let's study inside. When it comes to Tu B'Av, who was really happy? Who was really, really happy? So he tells us, Libnot Israel, to the daughters of Israel, Vadai Hayta Len Simcha. There is no question that for the daughters of Israel, Tu B'Av was a magnificent day. Because men, Ki Ha'ish Sheyesh Lo Nachala, if a man inherits, he can still marry whoever he wants. Haya Rashai, it would be permissible for him, Lisa Isha, to marry a woman, Mishevet Acher, from another tribe. Men had no limitations. On the other hand, up until the day they changed the policy, Haisha Lo Haitala Reshut, she had no permission, Imaitala Nachala, a woman, due to the fact that she inherited ancestral land, she would be limited. Until the exciting day that they got the heter, the allowance to marry whoever they desire, women were limited. So the result is the 15th of Av was a very happy day for women. And therefore, he says Rabbi Gansfried, V'ulai, and perhaps, Zeu kavanat Tosfot. This is what the Tosfot said. Because the Tosfot wrote, Dahainu Yom Tov, and Rabim Tamumai Bible say everybody, many authorities have been disturbed and have been struggling to really understand what is the message of the Tosfot, Dahainu Yom Tov. But says Rabbi Gansfried, you know how I understand this Hainu Yom Tov? It is a Rashet Tevot, not of Yom Tov, but Yom Tovatan, their good day. Kelomar Tovatan shel Bnot Israel. What Tosfot is telling us is the following, that due to the fact that the significance of the day is an allowance to women, so it was a happy day for women. Yom Tovatan, it was their good day. And with that in mind, we can appreciate the Mishnah. How practically did they celebrate Tu B'Av? By Bnot Yerushalayim, the daughters went out and celebrated. It was a Yom Tov for the women. That's what Tosfot is telling us. Fine. So what we have up until this point is basically one historical event that is shared with us by Talmudic authorities as to how the day gains significance. But there's another approach, okay? But beforehand, I would like to share with you the following. Do you know Tisha B'Av is a day that we mourn, but we have to identify the source of the mourning. And the source, more than anything else, is a lack of Jewish unity, a lack of achdut. If I view my fellow Jew as someone that is just a pain and someone that I have no interest in, and if I see practices that are different than the traditions that I grew up with, I view him as a goy, I have a problem here. That is the flaw of Tisha B'Av. Sinat Chinam. How is it fixed? When we view ourselves as a nation. When I understand that there's no such thing as your tribe and my tribe, we are Am Echad. So says Rav Tzadok HaKohen that you should know, the 15th of Av, the day when tribes were given this allowance to intermarry, you should know the result was Hitachdut Kol HaShvatim. The result was unity among all the tribes. Hitachdut Kol HaShvatim Yachad Demore. And you know what that indicates? You know what that indicates? That the young lady from the tribe of Menashe who could go ahead and marry someone from the tribe of Yehuda, you know what that teaches us? Heyot kulam am echad velo kol shevet bifnei atzmo. It teaches us, and what they were inspired on the 15th of Av, and clearly the rabbis want us to be inspired every Tu B'Av, is this nekuda, this point. We are Am Echad, okay? And as the Maharal explains that it was on that day they looked at things differently. Meaning up until the 15th of Av, they were thinking, you know what, if you're a woman, you're from a specific tribe, marry within your tribe. They saw things differently. They reassessed the situation because they were inspired by the power of the day of unity. Welcome to the 15th of Av. That's explanation number one. But I'm going to move on to explanation, the second one here, which is reference number 4, which is a little bit more tragic as to what led to the significance of the day. Now, let me tell you what I mean. So we have here the opinion of Rabbi Yosef in the name of Rav Nachman. And he tells us the following. Do you want to know what happened on the 15th of Av? What psak, what halachic guidance was given on that day that changed things? Because there was a time when there was a prohibition for the tribes of Israel to marry into the tribe of Binyamin. Something changed on the 15th of Av, and they got a Yom Shehutar Shevet Binyamin Levo Bakahal. A change occurred. They again reanalyzed the situation and were inspired on the 15th of Av to give an allowance that yes, you could give your daughter to someone from the tribe of Binyamin. Now, what is that about? The last 3 chapters of the book of Shoftim, of Judges, are from the most disturbing stories you could read in the Bible and the Tanakh. And it has the tragic story that was known as the story of the Pilegesh Bagiva, the concubine in a place called Giva. And it describes a section, again, it's a section that's difficult to read. It's from chapter 19 through 21 of the book of Judges. And briefly, we're talking about a concubine, right, like a semi-wife that was practices at that time, where she had an issue with her husband, and she goes back to her father, and the husband convinces the wife to come back home. It took some time, and it appears that they left late in the evening, and they landed up in an area that belonged to Binyamin, and people did not welcome them. The people of Binyamin did not welcome this individual and his concubine into their homes. Now, eventually an older man invites them in, but what happened was the locals were interested in using, it appears, the man and for sure the woman in a very inappropriate way. And it sounds very Sodom-like, because the text tells us that as the old man is welcoming this couple, Anshei Ha'ir, Anshei Vnei Belial, these empty people started knocking on the door, saying, give us this man, right? We want to have some fun with him. Now, we have to remember, although it is similar to the story of Sodom, there are differences. This is a minority. It's a small group. But as a community, the tribe of Binyamin had the responsibility of addressing this issue. The tragic story continues with the men, these men who carried no yoke and no responsibility, took the young concubine and raped her throughout the night, and they basically killed her. And the husband finds the woman in front of the doorstep by the morning with no life in her. He's upset, and he realizes that the tribe of Binyamin is simply not addressing the problem. So what he does, so you know what he does? He goes ahead and he takes this concubine and he cuts her into 12 pieces, and he sends it to the tribe of Israel and tells them, look what's happening here in the area of Binyamin. They have people that have no morals. They have people that basically raped and killed a lady, and the locals are not addressing the issue. So the result was that the tribes of Israel gathered, and there was a civil war, an awful civil war, the Gettysburg event of Eretz Yisrael. And they go to war, and the text describes that about 40,000 men fell during the war. Eventually, they basically wipe out the tribe of Binyamin, and there were only 600 men left of Binyamin. And the nation was so upset about it that we are told in the last chapter in the book of Judges that the Israelites took an oath in the mitzvah, and they said, Ish mimeno lo yiten bito leBinyamin leisha. They wiped out all the women of Binyamin. All left were 600 men, and therefore they decided that we're going to put an end to this tribe that is lacking ethics, do not address internal issues, and we're going to put an end to it by prohibiting our daughters to marry them. Now, this was a vow that was made when they were very passionate, but sometimes things change when you calm down, and they eventually calmed down, and they realize that they have a major problem here, because basically they have just determined that we are no longer going to have the 12 tribes of Israel. And they panicked. Eventually, they came up with a solution. There was a group of people in an area called Yavesh Gilad who did not commit to this vow. and they were able to find 400 women to marry 600 men. For the 200 missing, they worked out a system that they allowed the men of Binyamin to take women and not really hand them over. Now, it's a very complex text, which we're not studying here in great detail. But on one day, the people of Israel realized that, you know what, this is not good. We have to change this policy. That perhaps we made a vow that we don't give our daughters to members of the tribe of Binyamin, but that is only for this generation. And therefore, at some point, the vow was undone, like in Atarat Nedarim style. So what was the day that the people of Israel were inspired to reanalyze the vow and marry into the tribe of Binyamin? The 15th of Av. And as Rav Tzadok HaKohen of Lublin, the great 19th century authority, tells us, he says the following, that when they were very upset at the tribe of Binyamin, they thought that the best way of addressing this issue was hitrachkut, to keep away from people who are lacking values, keep away from a community that does not address such significant crimes within their community. That was their early thinking. But they were inspired on the 15th of Av to look at things differently. And they realized on that day, ve'ha'ikar, you know what's the best way to solve Jewish problems? When you see those who are not living the lifestyle the way they should, the ikar is ahavat Israel. And they realized that this is a day, they were inspired on the 15th of Av to recognize that we're one nation. V'zeh makor ha'geula. If Tisha B'Av is a day that we mourn destruction, the 15th of Av is a day of recovery. It's a day of recovery because we realize, you know what? We're one nation, and then we'll merit a geula. Now that was explanation number 2. Explanation number 3 was by Rabba Bar Bar Chana in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. And he tells us that as we know, throughout the years in the wilderness, every year, people, those who were of the generation of the Exodus, died out. That by the time they were ready to enter Eretz Yisrael, there were very, very few left from the generation of the Exodus. Now, it appears, according to Midrashim, that on Tisha B'Av, throughout the years in the wilderness, they would die. Those who would reach age 60 would die. Now, there are different Midrashim exactly what occurred on the 15th of Av. Some claim that the last year in the wilderness, when Tisha B'Av arrived, and those who thought that it's going to be their end survived, they were still in doubt until they saw the full moon and they knew it's the 15th of Av, and they were confident that on that day that they're going to live. So it was the Yom, the day, Shekalu bo matei midbar. It was the end of the generation of the Exodus dying out. But the Tosfot also shares with us the following. Every year they died on Tisha B'Av. Well, if Tisha B'Av was a day of passing for family members, it was the beginning of a Shiva. When would the Shiva end? Well, the beginning of 7 days later, right? Miksat Hayom Kekulo. The recovery from Tisha B'Av, the end of a Shiva from Tisha B'Av, is the 15th of Av. That is a day of recovery. That's what we are told. Fine. Now, another explanation in the Talmud, which is reference number 7. We're not going to spend too much time, but tragically, during the First Temple period, the northern tribes were not allowed to make their way to Yerushalayim because King Yerovam ben Nevat was concerned that if the Israelites would see the honor given to the house of David and the temple, it would be the end of his reign. So therefore, he put up these prosdiot, he put up these guards that prevented people from traveling. And you can't have Jewish unity if so many people don't make their way to the temple. But eventually, the last king of the Israelites, of the northern kingdom, Hoshea ben Allah, removed Bitel. So Ula tells us that on the 15th of Av, due to the fact that it's the day of unity, is the day Shebitel Hoshea ben Allah the prosdiot, Sheoshiv Yerovam ben Nevat. Those prosdiot, those guards that were established to, in essence, prevent the people of Israel of making their way to Jerusalem and feel that you are unified. You know that feeling by the Kotel, right? You look at the footage, you could see footage of the Kotel HaMa'aravi towards the end of Tisha B'Av, when people are together, they're singing. And you'll see all kind of backgrounds. And they all have one thing in common. Number one, they mourn the loss of the Bet HaMikdash. Number two, they appreciate the fact that they could gather together by the Kotel to express the sadness. But they do it as a nation. And there's this feeling of unity that you get when you come to Yerushalayim. And even if it was there for a short time, it has value. There was a unity that was achieved on the 15th of Av when King Hoshea removed them and the Israelites were given permission to make their way to Jerusalem. So again, it all symbolizes this idea, a day of unity. Now, it's also, as mentioned, the day of recovery. So we'll go in reference number 8 for another reason presented in the Talmud. And this is Rav Masna who tells us that you should know, among the many things we commemorate and we mourn on Tisha B'Av is the destruction of the city of Beitar during the rebellion of Bar Kokhba, 60 years after the destruction. The Romans, with brutality, destroyed the city of Beitar, and according to our tradition, did not allow the rest of the nation to bury the remains of those who were laying there in the fields. Eventually, permission was granted. And when it was granted, there was a miracle that bodies did not decompose. They saw it as a sign from heaven that even in the lowest points of our history, God Almighty is with us. And therefore, they recognize that, you know what? If God is with us, this is the beginning of rebound. You know what I mean? When you have a situation that things are going down, and then there's a beginning of a rebound, you know that you're going to be making your way upward. That is what they sense, that there's going to be a recovery. So therefore, Amata tells us that the day the day that they were able to bury the remains of those who lived in the city of Beitar, and they saw that the hand of God is involved in their state, and a recognition that, you know what, that's a sign that there are better things waiting for us. It was a day of recovery, Tu B'Av as well. Explanation, the last one shared in the Talmud, where Rabban and Rav Yosef tell us the following. When the Jews returned to Jerusalem to reestablish the second temple and the second commonwealth, it appears that some families took it upon themselves to donate wood for the altar. And it was considered something significant. Donating wood for the altar, your family would be given a specific day, and your children and grandchildren will retain the right for donating wood to the altar. Wood placed on the altar or wood given to the altar was always a symbol of a future. In other words, in Eretz Yisrael, there's a spiritual fire, connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in appreciation to the land, connecting to one another. But you need to have something physical where it takes hold. The wood on the altar symbolizes the wood of rebuilding, Eretz Yisrael. So wood for the altar, always significant. But there was a problem where it appears that if you go ahead and pick wood, chop wood, and there's moisture in it, you're going to have infestation in it. For the altar, the wood had to be bug-free. Today, they have those Bodek vegetables. Perhaps in those days they had bodek wood. It had to be without infestation. So therefore it was designated that they're going to chop wood during the months when there's intense heat. When things start cooling down a little bit in the Middle East, they're going to stop chopping the wood. The wood is only chopped until the 15th of Av. So now we got this fact. Yom, it is the day. Shepasku melichrot, when they stop chopping the etzim, the wood, for the maracha, for the altar. But what's the significance there? So there are two things that are significant. Number one, it's an end that you celebrate. And number two, it's a beginning. Number one, it's like a siyum. If you study a tractate and you complete it, it's a celebration, you do a siyum. If you're involved in a mitzvah, right? Imagine you're involved in a fundraising campaign and you're actively involved in it. And you put in a lot of time and effort, and then it's done. Mission accomplished. You could celebrate, or perhaps you should celebrate, because it's like a siyum. I've completed a mitzvah. So explanation number one to the significance of Tu B'Av, it is a day of a siyum. They've completed the task of chopping wood. They are celebrating their achievement. That's one explanation. Explanation number two is that as Torah Jews, we know there are times where we are to focus on action, and there are times that we are supposed to focus on development, right? So there's a healthy balance there. There are times that I focus on studying, on learning information, and then other times where I am required to act. Now, the winter months, when you have long nights, the rabbis highly recommend that a person finds time for limud haTorah, for Torah study. Meaning, in a society that worked only during the day, and you have long days during the summer, you can't expect a person to come home at night at 9:30 and open a Mishnah, a little bit of Tanakh, or a section of the Talmud. The energy is not there. You worked a long day. But winter months are a little bit different. Winter months, the days are shorter, the nights are longer. What did you achieve during the nights? So the Talmud tells us that due to the fact that at this point, more or less, your nights are starting to get longer, and you can increase your learning of Torah, that is what we are celebrating. And the truth is, this insight that it's a time, Tu B'Av is the beginning to increase Torah study, for me relates very much to the idea of Jewish unity, because an approach to Jewish unity that is just based on the fact that people are born Jewish, or I feel that they are members of my tribe, is not going to be able to withstand significant challenge. In other words, if I feel that someone's a member of my tribe, but then he agitates me, okay, so what if he's my tribe? I don't want to have anything to do with him. But if I go ahead and study the words of Torah, and I learn every single day about the importance of my tradition and what my nation's about, and the fact that we have a creator that is concerned for every single one of us, and I feel that connection through Torah, the result is, and I've seen it, the result is that people who learn Torah lishma for the right reason, the result is a valid Ahavat Yisrael, a true Ahavat Yisrael. And therefore, if we are going to be meditating on this Shabbos of what Tu B'Av is about, we can be mindful of that, all that we reviewed and studied here tonight. But perhaps it's also the time that we can go ahead and increase a little bit of the learning of Torah. And when a person learns the words of Torah with an understanding of why it was given and what it achieves, I deeply believe, and I like sharing the story that my Rosh Hashiva loved sharing, where my Rosh Hashiva, Rabbi Mochaim Levin Zatzal, used to study Daf Yomi. Now, in the world of yeshivos, it is not common for every head of yeshiva to study Daf Yomi, because they are involved in in-depth analysis, and the study with the pace of Daf Yomi is simply not practical. But nevertheless, Rabbi Levin felt that due to the fact that this is the text that the people of Israel as a whole are studying, I want to be part. And he found time to study the Daf Yomi. So he shared with us the story that one time he was traveling, and the Daf Yomi was on Menachos, page 95 or 98, and he was thinking to himself as he was traveling, isn't it fascinating that here I have to travel, which he didn't enjoy, and the section of Daf Yomi is analyzing the journey of our ancestor in the wilderness, the Masaot. So for him, it was quite fascinating that the Daf Yomi is addressing his personal journey. So he sat down on a plane and he opened up his Talmud. And a few minutes later, a person sits down next to him who shares with Rabbi Levin the exact same thought. It's interesting. The Daf Yomi today is talking about traveling. Rabbi Levin got very excited and he said, you know what, let's study it together. So here he would share that I'm dealing here with a complete stranger and I'm studying with him a text that brings us all together. He was extremely inspired by it. And the message, obviously, for us was, when you study text, any text of Torah, yes, by Daf Yomi, you could sit down and find the Chavruta on a plane, but any text of Torah, you think about the fact that it is not just the text of the past, and obviously the text that will lead us to the future. In the present, you are connected to our nation. You are valuing what so many people are valuing throughout the Jewish world. It's unity, and it's a healthy unity, because Torah gives us the tools to deal. When someone does agitate me, I still remember the fact that according to tradition, I'm supposed to overcome whatever natural feelings I have. Torah provides it. The study of Torah provides it. That's how we can achieve Jewish unity. And that's how we can make the 15th of Av a day of complete recovery of Tisha B'Av. So it's an opportunity to wish everyone that it should be not just a good Shabbos, but it should be a day that we tap into this idea of feeling connected to one another, connected to Klal Yisrael, connected to our tradition, and realizing that we are recovered. We are recovered. The Mazel's recovered. And without doubt, if we really tap into the message of the day, it's a recovery for the nation as a whole. So, number one, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us tonight in our study.